Bom dia, Senhor Presidente. Obrigada por partilhar os seus pensamentos conosco. The least I can do for you speaking English today. But just on a more serious note, and also to give you a leg stretch, I think it would be untoward to start today's session and talk about migration and refugees and not recognize the 25 years of the Rwanda genocide, especially that it displaced a lot of people who ended up in refugee camps. So I'm going to ask that we stand and observe a moment of silence. Thank you. So this morning, if we're still in the morning session, we have the privilege of chatting to Randy Newcomb, who will share his journey to strategic philanthropy in the field of youth employment and migration, and to share his thoughts on some of the unique approaches to supporting local initiatives and social enterprises. Randy is a senior advisor of a media network. He's also president and CEO of Humanity United, which is one of the largest private donors in the field of international human rights. And Humanity United seeks to build peace and advance human freedom in the corners of the globe where these ideals are challenged most. I'm sure Randy will share with us more later on. I wanted to stay clear of the data today because I think we've heard a lot of stats throughout the weekend. And I wanted to take the time out to humanize migration and, I guess, people in refugee camps. 6 years ago, I went to a conference, the ALN network, and they have a session where they give young people an opportunity to either present their businesses or organizations. And I was struck by a young man, because I think we really want to discuss solutions today. I was struck by a young man who was speaking about his experience as a child in a refugee camp. He started doing odd jobs on the side and realized that he was raising enough money to be able to educate himself. With that, he convinced 4 of his other friends to join him, and they raised enough money to send themselves to school. And it became a ripple effect. And over time, whatever extra money they were making, they started to educate other people. That young man's name is, let me give it justice and not bite my tongue, Joseph Munyambanza. He's a Congolese refugee who's actually currently in his late 20s. He started an international youth organization to transform Africa, which helps refugees, especially girls, to complete primary school and enter secondary school. What's really incredible about this young man's story is that Lady Luck really smiled on the refugees in Kayawangli, which is a western part of Uganda, when Munyambaza himself was admitted into the prestigious African Leadership Academy, which is where I met him, in South Africa. Later on, once he was able to complete his high school, and later on, him and 3 of his friends applied for and secured MasterCard Foundation scholarships to get tertiary education in the US. Today, Joseph has studied biochemistry at Westminster College in the US, and since 2013, the MasterCard Foundation has actually offered scholarships to over 30 male and females living in the Kayawangli refugee camp to study at universities around the world. And for me, that's just an incredible story of one young man who turned his opportunity to 4 to over thousands. And I'm sure it's many more, because we know that on the continent, for every employment created for one person, you're feeding 5 to 8 mouths. So I just wanted to humanize today's session, but importantly, as we speak about solutions, we must speak about solutions that perhaps with the eyes and the ears of people who are either in camps and understand what it is that we're providing solutions for. So I'm hoping that as we go through our conversation with you, Randy, we can come to a point where we see concrete solutions like Joseph and his friends, and maybe think about how we, as a collective, find initiatives to engage in. And next year, at the next Africa Philanthropy Forum, we've got a monitoring tool that allows us to track maybe something we would have come up with together. I'm hoping Randy has a great idea that we can we can engage on. So Randy, to come to you, can you touch a bit on your work and some of the programs of Humanity United?
Happy to do it, and thank you, Sophie, and it's terrific to be here. And I actually represent the Omidyar group, which includes Humanity United, Omidyar Network, Luminate, and a variety of other foundations that make up the efforts of Pierre Omidyar. Pierre Omidyar was the founder of eBay, and we represent roughly $500 million a year investment activity across Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, Europe. And we're involved in any number of different activities globally. And in fact, with my good friend here from Tunisia, perhaps we can connect later. We do quite a bit of work around the human trafficking space, and I happen to have a near and dear love for your country, so I'd be delighted to talk with you after the session about what we're engaged in on the human trafficking space. I will say at the basis of what animates and inspires the Omidyar group are the personal human stories. You know, we're moved by the entrepreneurial, hopeful approach that oftentimes we see among young people that are in some of the most difficult, challenging places around the world. And just to build on your story, while you were reflecting upon this young person, a couple of years ago I was in eastern Chad and met a young man who likewise was in a refugee camp and developed a friendship with him, and we did just a few things as we could. We purchased him a computer, we made sure that he had some classes around technology and the like. And since that point, this young man figured out a way to hack into the UNHCR web, to the bandwidth at the UNHCR offices and began to reach out to a whole ecosystem of individuals around the world. And I was just so impressed by the entrepreneurial instinct of this young guy. And since then, we've continued to invest in some of the things that he's done since that point. But this is some of the basis of what really inspires much of what we do across Omidyar Group. And frankly, I think the smart money, my colleagues that were just here from Echo Bank and from the African Development Bank, the smart money, in my view, is coming to Africa because this is really the opportunity for us in the future.
So, Randy, you touched on a word, hopeful. I know I said I wouldn't touch on data, but as the conversation is flowing, I have to go back to it. In the forum report that came out, one of the statistics, it's not really in numbers, but it says that most people actually move for hope. So how do we create hope? You know, what do we really need to get around in terms of barriers for, how do we rectify the barriers or dismantle them in order for youth to have greater opportunity on the continent so that hope remains, it's much more of an economic migration and it's not migration out of necessity?
Well, that's a great question, Sophie. I have a particular point of view that perhaps some of you may hold and some of you won't, and I've discovered over the last couple of hours that this is a spirited conversation, so I'm sure I will provoke some dialogue on this. But I happen to believe that some of the best philanthropy is that philanthropy that is willing to take some of the greatest risk. And the philanthropic dollars that are invested are a tiny portion of the total financial capital investment flows globally. And I think to leverage philanthropy in some of the best ways, we have to also be willing to take some of the highest risk and pursue some of the greatest returns. Historically, we can point to ways in which everything from the Green Revolution across Africa and South America to some of the evolutions in North America was sparked by philanthropic resources. And at the time, they were considered to be highly, highly risky. But the ways in which they sparked entire new economies and entire new movements were transformative to those societies. So in my view, some of the best philanthropy is some of the highest risk. Now, all too often, I think we view philanthropy as charity. And I think that's a tragedy. I don't think, of course, we should be investing in things that are charitable in approach, but oftentimes we end with charity and we don't anticipate how those resources can really de-risk entire markets and drive economies and then drive transformation in some really powerful ways.
You know, you speak about history. Every time I think about history, I think about how most societies were actually created by economic migrants. I look at the US, some of the largest businesses and philanthropic families are actually originally not from the States. Why are we so nervous to talk migration in a positive light? That it's okay to move around, it's okay to build a new generation somewhere else. It doesn't mean that, 5 generations later, if I think about South Africa in my cases, 5 generations later, there are people who've been in the country from China, but the person's not Chinese, they're South African. So why are we so nervous to be accepting of both the people, but the benefit that they bring into countries?
Well, of course, that's a challenge that we're facing right now. As we sit here today, I'm afraid the U.S. still, the U.S. has a president that believes that our future is a future that has walls built around the United States. And that's not an inspiring future for anybody. And I'm afraid the corrosive approach to nationalism is taking hold in many parts of the world that is a result of this fear of migrants. And it's such an unusual phenomena. The U.S. is made up of individuals who migrated and took advantage of the opportunities there. And so we find ourselves now fearful of refugees and migrants. But the reality is, if you look at some of the biggest companies in the United States, from Microsoft to Google, the founder of eBay, they all come from migrant families. And they've created some of the greatest value that exists. And so I do think there's something about changing that narrative. And that's an area, actually, frankly, I think philanthropically, we can begin to address that narrative that doesn't really actually represent the value that migrants bring to our countries.
And then just to touch back on the comment you made about the definition of philanthropy and people getting it wrong. I absolutely, if one thing, my pet peeve is people not understanding that. So I want to touch now on the role of philanthropists. So when I look at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, the fact that we are even shining a spotlight today on the topic of African migration and unemployment of youth is because the money is invested into data that allows us to have engaging conversation. The Aliko Dangote Foundation is invested in the North with helping families reintegrate post the Boko Haram attacks. You've got the Tony Elumelu Foundation trying to groom over 10,000 young entrepreneurs who will later provide jobs. What do you think should be the role of philanthropists or influencers in managing to help countries solve the issues collaborate with countries to solve the issues around youth unemployment, migration, that it happens in a positive way?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. Our colleague here from the agricultural education program stepped out, and I'm a little bit fearful to say anything about ecosystems, but I actually believe that we should be taking a systems approach, or in this particular case, an ecosystems approach. And across the Omidyar Group, you will find our foundations and our companies and our initiatives doing a whole set of systemic investments to actually build the ecosystems that contribute to the well-being of migrants and frankly, young people and entrepreneurs in the future. And so if you look across Omidyar Group, you will find any number of different investment opportunities, from education and entrepreneurship to fintech, financial technology investment opportunities, good governance and the rule of law, IT connectivity and digital divide efforts, and venture investments. I don't know how many of you were in the session, I think it was yesterday, I believe, Sophie, where we heard this young woman ask the question, she said, how is it possible that myself, an entrepreneur in Nigeria, cannot get access to venture capital whereby an American can come in and has far more access to venture capital than I do? I think that's a tragedy. I really do. And I think this is a role that philanthropy should be playing, that we should be willing to make sure that our resources and our assets are available to local individuals, young people in the very countries that they come from, to drive the SME activity that they're involved in.
The lady from African Development Bank spoke about mindset, but I think what you raise is this issue of trust. And for me, it's why don't Africans trust each other? So how do we change this mindset? Well, I guess when we spoke yesterday, I asked you is when you raise that 100 million fund to do the work you do in terms of in the human rights space, how difficult was it to convince those with money to come to the table with you? And so I guess the question I want to ask is, how do we go about, in the space of migration, having the conversation with funders to put their money where it makes an impact in the space?
Now, that's an excellent question. You're actually referring to a fund that we started 5 years ago called the Freedom Fund, and it happens to be around some of the human trafficking work that we do. And I began, almost a decade or so ago, I began to recognize that when it came to efforts around human trafficking, that you had a lot of philanthropists that were interested in this particular field, but individually, their resources were minuscule to address the challenges at a global level. And that if we were ever going to see kind of a transformative impact, that we had to work together collectively. All too often, philanthropy can begin to look like more of a vanity project of the founder. And all too often, we begin to take approaches and just work individually without working collectively. So I initiated a conversation, and my colleagues initiated a conversation with other philanthropists to say, hey, we can begin to organize the philanthropic space to drive towards solid impact and transformation against human trafficking if we work together. And so we founded two other high net worth individuals and philanthropists that were willing to come in at a significant amount of money and raise a $100 million fund to really begin to drive solid long-term programming to address trafficking practices around the world. Now, this question of trust is a big one, and it takes time. You have to build confidence and trust in one another where individuals and organizations are willing to commingle their funds. And I think where we get it wrong is that we're not willing to take the time to do that. And you need sort of that face-to-face experience, that face-to-face opportunities where other individuals begin to trust your intentions and you can also trust their intentions as well.
Well, where's the team at APF? I think I saw earlier on you guys put up something about ongoing projects, about joint initiatives. I think Randy would be great to probably come on board and help you around that collaboration process as we think about, is there a solution that comes out of here that you guys might want to push forward and have a conversation with some of the members in the team. But anyway, I want to go back a bit. One of the, I guess you speak about philanthropy sometimes being this vanity project. So for me, I'm always interested in whether or not people are measuring their impact enough. So I'm keen to hear how you guys measure the work that you do, and how should we be using the right measurement or monitoring tools to track the impact that philanthropy has on the various initiatives?
It's a tough subject, right? Because the for-profit venture money that we put into play into the market, obviously the ROI of those resources or those investments give us a terrific proxy for whether we're successful or not. When we're talking about some of the social impact activities that we're involved in, what we find that we have to do is we have to identify particular proxies that represent a return. And so we're very disciplined across all of our work, across the Omidyar Group companies and foundations, to make sure that we've identified what those proxies are. And oftentimes they happen to be idiosyncratic to what we're interested in. Unfortunately, the marketplace is not the philanthropic marketplace is not at the point yet where we have shared proxies for-profit ROI. But we are very disciplined internally at Omidyar Group to make sure that we identify those proxies in advance and we're tracking those over time to see if we're successful.
I know earlier on I spoke about collaboration with governments and philanthropists. I want to be a bit more controversial now and say, do we actually need to be working with governments when private money is involved and that can shift and that can shift and move quick enough to make a real dent in the lives of people? Do we need the relationship with the governments, or when is it that we should need those relationships?
Well, obviously, my particular point of view is that government is going to help to create the platform to drive economic growth. And so there's free trade, their governance, the rule of law, provisions that support that need to be in place. And so in those particular contexts, we have to work with government. And, but we shouldn't stop there, right? And all too often we kind of stop at that policy side without then moving forward around for example, making investment capital available to young entrepreneurs. And we have to sort of walk our talk. So it's not enough just to advocate for good policy. We also have to be willing to be able to use our capital in ways that might be risky, to de-risk those marketplaces and to drive entrepreneurial growth.
I think that all too often we speak about migration. The conversation about migration is also concentrated too much on not letting people move. What I think we touched briefly on it yesterday when we were having a brief chat, is when you look at people who've moved and end up maybe in a refugee camp, that notion that the grass is green on the other side, they get there and discover that they can't, go to the US or the EU within even a year. Sometimes it takes 5 years, sometimes it takes 10 years for somebody to get a green card. How do we, firstly, how long, in your experience, does it take to reintegrate somebody into society? And how do we develop programs that are specifically geared to assisting that side of migration? Before, I guess it's that middle point before the next move, because a lot of people are in camps for sometimes over 10 years.
Yeah, that's right. Many of us have been to those camps, right? And one of the largest camps on the border with South Sudan and Kenya, it's hard to call it a refugee camp. It's a city, right? It's been there for 35 years now. But I have a sense that there's something about the human spirit and the individual that given the conditions to improve their life, most people will take hold of those opportunities. And I'm afraid that I'll just say Americans, oftentimes we're paternalistic in how we think about individual entrepreneurs in refugee camps. I think our colleague here from EcoBank just was so spot on when he talked about the rich entrepreneurialism that is happening right now in refugee camps around the world. And given the opportunity, given the resources, individuals will improve their lifestyle and will seek out opportunity. Now, of course, there are many others that the conditions aren't ripe and everything else, that public health contributes to the inability to do that. But there are far more that, given the opportunities, will improve they will pursue their own livelihoods in ways that are really productive and promising for the future.
You said a word that actually sparked off an idea in my head. City. You said the refugee camp has become a city. So shouldn't we then be looking at a point where there's a collaboration with governments to think about converting a camp into new livable cities and just invest, or it becomes an investment to that moving from a refugee camp to just being a new city, and people are reintegrated back into that society? There's registration, there's birthing. I guess the difficulty is if they're not nationals of that country, it might pose some problems. But I wonder, would an idea like that move forward?
I think it's a really interesting idea, and we can. I think an analog for that. Just about a year ago, we were visiting a refugee camp along the border of Jordan and Syria, and any number of Syrian refugees had come across the border into Jordan. And my friends at the IKEA Foundation, they had invested heavily both in ICT, IT technology, to create a blockchain technologies to be able to transfer for financial technology. And they had also invested in a solar grid for energy. And so just these two investments alone, both the fintech investment for blockchain access, as well as the investment in solar. It's the world's only solar-powered refugee camp, and it addresses the energy needs, plus it kicks off energy into the Jordanian power grid. The creation of that platform has literally energized entrepreneurial activity in ways that wouldn't have existed previous to that. Now, whether or not these Syrians actually want to go home, 25 kilometers back into Syria or not is a really good question. Should they be asked to stay there? Should they create a city or not? I think it's a really interesting proposition that you make. But at least while they're there, can we at least invest in the platform so if they want to engage in entrepreneurial activities, they have the ability to do that. And if you go there, we drove down the middle of this refugee camp and you saw everything. I mean, you've seen it before, you've been there, but you saw everything from tailors to restaurants to schools to laundry facilities, all run by entrepreneurs in this particular refugee camp.
So Randy, let's assume you didn't have all this money, so I give you a fresh bill, maybe 5 billion somewhere that I've got. Where would you put your money today in terms of curbing youth unemployment, and then on the other side, where would you put your money in terms of like the end product on the refugee side?
Well, I tell you what, I happen to be one of those in the camp that would move to the agripreneurs. That I'd be putting a lot of money in that particular space, and our good colleague now is back, and so I'm gonna say ecosystems again because you said you never heard it before. Now you've heard it twice. Okay, and I think good money after really good money actually invests in that ecosystem in agriculture. And if we take a macroeconomic view, our colleague from the African Development Bank, our colleague from the ILO referenced, I think, an 80-year time frame. I think if we take even just a 10-year decadal time frame, I think the global economic powerhouse will increasingly shift towards Africa. You see what's taking place in the north is aging populations, and as a result of that, the economies are slowing down. In the US alone right now, they're projecting 2% more or less GDP growth in 2020 alone. We see the growth of the labor force at roughly 1% right now, right? And so there's no way you can sustain a growing GDP with a labor force that only grows by 1%. So the economies of the North are going to start looking for the labor force of the South to drive global economic growth. With the evolution of connectivity and digital access in the South, that then will, I think, be able to draw upon the growing labor force that we find in places like Africa and elsewhere that can contribute to that global economic growth. So, frankly, I'd be putting money there if I had that $5 billion at my disposal. Frankly, if I had, 10,000 at my disposal, I'd still be putting those resources behind that with a long-term view of what we might see take place in the next decade, next 20 years, next 30 years.
Great. So what I want to do is actually break protocol for 2 seconds. I want to split the next section into one Q&A, and then the last half to hear from some of you, like very briefly, so that we can give enough people in the room and still make time. What would you suggest should be the solutions? So I'm going to spend the first kind of couple of minutes doing the Q&A so you guys can share in the conversation with me and talk to Randy. But stick to questions, please. I'm quite strict, so don't be offended if I stop you and ask you, what's the question? Shoot to question, unless you do have to make a point before. with the knowledge that in the second half of the Q&A session, we're going to move into your suggestions for practical solutions that we can then put together into some form of one-pager for APF. So does anyone have a question? Who wants to join me? There's a gentleman over there.
Yes, good afternoon already. Randy, just if you'd elaborate a little bit more on sort of the development of partnerships that you have seen, would be good to know specifically on the African continent. Linking that a little bit to the way how to best and most economically efficiently utilize those resources. What obviously is happening is many players are engaged in similar work streams, so it would be good if you could shed some light on how you approach the partnership angle. Thank you.
I'll take another one and then Randy can answer that.
Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca. I'm from Ghana. And thank you, Randy, for sharing all your experiences around, where philanthropy is going. And I'm happy that you have a sort of long-term view. You're looking at 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I work in a foundation in Ghana. And, the challenge you get when you're looking for philanthropy is that there's a myopic view about results happening now, because when you're working in governance work, you're working on peace building, on relationship building, on anti-corruption. How do you monitor and how are you able to satisfy the people who support your work around those areas? We are getting to know more about social impact investing, and what does that mean for the dividends of philanthropy. Secondly, I would like to know, what is the future of philanthropy in Africa? Where do you see it going? Carl spoke a lot about the individuals, 360 million people bringing in $1 each. Do you think that would work in the next 10 years as opposed to big capital bringing in money to support the work that we do? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll let Randy answer that now.
Well, there's two really excellent questions on this partnership question. Our orientation there is it's twofold. So, obviously we're looking to when we're engaged in partnerships, not just in Africa but elsewhere, we're looking to support and drive impact. Clearly, otherwise, why would you engage in a partnership? But secondarily, I think there's kind of a knock-on effect around how is it that you, and I think even more importantly, how is it that you continue to build both human and intellectual capital? So it would be very easy for an Omidyar group, and I know for Gates and some Rockefeller and some of the other big funders to kind of roll in on your own and use your own intellectual capital or human capital and kind of drive a particular program. And frankly, on a long-term basis, you kind of undermine the development of human capital. And in my view, that's part of what we're trying to achieve in our work around partnerships. And frankly, for me, it gets to a level of values. It's, so much of philanthropy can be, I'll say ego-based. And in particular, I find this among American philanthropists. And we really miss an opportunity here. We really miss a chance to support and build the human capital that exists on the ground and the ways that we can contribute that in some really humble approaches. So that's the objective of partnership. And frankly, I learned so much just from the panels today, from President Perez. His comments were just so inspiring to me. So I think we miss those when we don't pay attention to human capital. Now, I think the long-term view. I am so bullish on African philanthropy. I think that African philanthropists can learn from the mistakes of the past in America and Europe and build on those mistakes to inspire a whole new generation of transformative philanthropy in ways that American philanthropy never quite got right. And my colleague from the African Development Bank, she said it right. She said, there's a positive story about the future of African philanthropy that we should not be apologetic about, that we should celebrate and recognize that we have an opportunity, you have an opportunity here to transform the future of philanthropy on this continent, unlike any other time in history. And that inspires me, you know, and so I take a long-term view there, and I take a very positive view of what that might look like.
Sorry, before I take a question, you've just sparked something else. You talk about African philanthropy. When I think about African philanthropy, I actually think that Africans have been giving for the longest time. We just haven't coached it under the umbrella of philanthropy. And you're right. The day we move from the giving, the act of giving, and couching it in philanthropy, we will see that how the giving has taken place goes to the core of the challenge and does make an impact. With that, I'll take another question. No questions? Everybody's burning to give me solutions, I guess.
Oh, I have a strong voice. I'm sure this will work. I outlined some of the challenges with agricultural transformation earlier, and you said that if you were to invest in anything, it would be agri-entrepreneurs. My question has to do with the role of philanthropy to correct or even replace state functions such as extension services or agricultural research. What role do you see philanthropy playing in that generally, and the arising African philanthropy playing in that in the future?
Well, I think the best money in our money is on the arising entrepreneur, frankly. And we've looked at this before, the work of extension officers and the like, and I don't know. I just don't know if we're going to get the kind of ROI that we want if we try to take that one on versus say, hey, actually there's some entrepreneurs, the agro-entrepreneurs and the like, who are beginning to think about that approach in a different way, that sort of the best money is probably on those individuals, and we can spend a lot of time, a lot of resource, and a whole lot of frustration working with governments and not see the kind of change and transformation that we might want, versus those individuals who are really working from on the ground, on the inside, and beginning to demonstrate ways to do this in a different, more transformative approach. So, you know, others might have a different point of view on that.
My question was really about the fact that extension services aren't working does not mean that philanthropy should fund that or work with government. But how can philanthropy replace that missing function, which is an essential function in agriculture?
It's an excellent question, right? But I'd still put the money into the next generation of entrepreneurs and see them as the next generation, kind of an analog to the extension officers in the future. So that's not perhaps too terribly satisfying, but it's a way that I think it helps us navigate into the future away from the past.
If I may just react to that, it's extraordinarily satisfying. I can introduce you to a perfect little entrepreneur in Zinde in Niger that I fell in love with a couple of weeks ago. And I think that would work. I wonder if that one is scalable.
Good, very good, thank you. Well, I'd like to hear about this individual.
Any more questions? Okay, so we'll kick into the second half, and I'm sure somebody will have a question as we move on. I may have more questions than I move on, but I don't want to take up the whole day talking to Randy, because Randy and I decided that we could have a conversation about this topic all day. Does anybody have a solution? Is anyone working in a space that you mentioned something earlier on, maybe you want to share a solution for the group that we may want to table for APF to think about? Guys, I know it's Sunday, but somebody has to say something. You were allowed yesterday. You said you don't want to hear about the what, you want to hear about the what, the how. Please give us a how. There's no such. You were told there's no free lunch here. So I'd like to hear a how from you. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Is there a question? Oh, yes. I can come back to him. We can take from you. Comment.
This is not necessarily a solution, but it's at least a kind of, hopefully a bridge to some. And what I find most interested in the presentation so far is that we keep operating within the framework of an existing set of models of how we do things. And as an example, the conversations about education, we're still thinking about different levels of existing school systems when you don't need that to do what we're talking about doing, or we're attempting to do. Short-term intensive educational programs directed at specific issues among populations can be done in matters of months that'll have transformative impact. But when we come to these, and they're the kinds of, it's the kind of education that people who are working can take advantage of. They're not going to go back to school and do a master's degree in this or that and translate that into something that's going to work for them in the agribusiness, say. So we need to kind of break away from these traditional frameworks and models and trying to repackage or refit them and start thinking about already tested models of things that exist that can be looked at and inserted into these old places to create new results. And I'll just let that.
Yeah, actually, I couldn't agree more with you. We see this happening in the U.S. actually right now, where I come from Silicon Valley, as where we live, and there's a movement. I'm not sure how I feel about it, to tell you the truth, but there's a movement to skip college and to go directly into the marketplace. I think there's some benefits still of a higher education liberal arts degree, but I still believe that we have a mindset that suggests that you can't be an entrepreneur, you can't enter the workplace, you can't kind of develop the skills that make for a productive, healthy, lifelong experience outside of higher education, which I know that to not be the case. And I know that there's real benefits towards some of the approaches that you really suggest.
And I'll just add that in the context in which we exist today, and I'll talk specifically about the American education system, which is too much a model for others. We're more about credentialing and creating a credential base than if you will, a credentialing kind of presence and knowledge than to actually prepare people to do stuff. And we're in a situation where we're trying to use education to prepare people to do stuff. And I think we can probably let go of some of the credentialing aspects in order to move that particular agenda forward.
He's ready.
Good day, everyone. My name is Promise Amaha. So while you prodded me, I remember the question I wanted to ask Alhaji Aliko Dangote yesterday, so maybe I'll throw it up now so we could deliberate about it. First of all, I think there is very poor emphasis on research, innovation, development in Africa. It's a critical area we need to really consider. And we've over time recommended that in our institutions, like we have in Nigeria, we have the vice chancellors and we have the deputy vice chancellor, administration, and all that. We need a deputy for research and innovation development. So there are more emphasis can be placed on research and innovation, because every ecosystem is anchored on dynamic research, and that's critical to development across border in Africa. But that's on the one side. Then talking about the meeting yesterday, Alhaji promised that he's setting up 1 million metric ton rice processing facility. I'm sure we all heard that yesterday. Very commendable initiative. And that was going to employ about 150,000 young people in the agribusiness sector. Fantastic. So we have a country that annually we churn out an average of 4 million unemployed graduates. So you find out that 150,000 is still a far cry from what can be done. So this is me thinking out loud. What if Alhaji doesn't give us the high yield seedlings to farm for his meal, the 1 million metric tons, and decides to engage us in an expanded value chain and value-added services, where we are part of the production of the high yield seedlings that would eventually have us farm and also feed the meal. In that process, you find out that 150,000 employer base can be increased further and expanded further. So there's critical need for value-added services and expanded value chain, as against most of our African capitalists just giving us these farm inputs, as we popularly call them, and then we produce for their facilities to meet up with their capacity. So, it's an area I think we need to emphasize, the area of research and innovation development in Africa, and the area of expanded value chain and value-added services. We can do these things. We have, it doesn't have to be a farmer. We're creating jobs. So if we have a biochemist or we have a geneticist look at opportunities of raising high-yield seedlings across different agricultural primary production value chain, then that speaks to more job creation within the value chain. So finally, I'm able to say something. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Randy, do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I actually think that there you point to, that's one of the legitimate areas where I think government can help us in the development of policy in industrial zones that incentivize value creation instead of shipping raw products elsewhere for that value to be created. But tax structures and treaties and the like can create these industrial zones where you as the entrepreneur are incentivized to add the value closer to the production rather than ship it, to the urban areas or, even worse, ship it to Europe or the US for that value to be added. And I do think that's an area that we should be and many are advocating that governments play that particular role.
Okay, I've got a last one from the floor, then I have to wrap up the session. Gentleman over here. Where's the mic? Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Tom Carver, and I am involved in a project called Africa Works. I think there is just picking up what this gentleman said, I think there is a particular market failure that philanthropy could address around the inability or the difficulty that a lot of African experts have, whether it's seeds or nutrition or in the public health sector, in accessing work opportunity. I mean, there's rightly been a lot of conversation about basic education and bringing up capacity, but there are already thousands of highly talented African experts in different fields, technical experts, that for some reason they may not have the right network or they may not have the right knowledge of, if they have 5 out of 7 of the right criteria, they may not have the right soft skills. They are not getting that opportunity to work. And I think there's much more that could be done to leverage those people, to build a better system, in other words, an ecosystem around these group of experts across the continent.
I actually think the African Philanthropy Forum could play a role here around this market failure, that if working collectively as a working group of sorts, to begin to build that ecosystem of relationships, that we could use our resources towards that, and to help those, as you rightly point out, thousands if not millions of experts that for whatever reason aren't connected in those networks. That would be an incredible way to really add value that could spark some important market expansion and transformation.
Okay, I really am going to take a final one because I want to respect our time and your time. The gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is Dominic Charles. I work for the International Rescue Committee. One area I think the foundation can be really, really good, it's the connection with private sector. I didn't hear that much about public-private partnership, But I think this is an area, because of the connection, most of those foundations, they are from private sector. They can really help working not only with the government, but also with either international or local NGO in order to bring the know-how, and also in order to give opportunity for the youth to get access into entrepreneurship or access to employment. We have talked a lot about entrepreneurs, which is great, but we cannot have 10 million entrepreneurs at once. So I think also we need to focus a lot on employment and also training. What kind of training that we need for those youth? Are they going to stay in vocational training for like 2 years, or are they going to learn something more practical? And I think the foundation can be really a good asset in bridging this gap.
No, excellent point. And this goes to the former comments around the credentialing aspects of higher education and using education as a way to more quickly develop the skills for people to respond on a more timely basis.
Randy, you've been a great guest, but before I let you go, I think I did warn you yesterday that I might ask you for a practical solution for the APF to take forward and think about. So I don't know if you've had a chance to think through what you might suggest happens before I close off.
You know, I didn't want to answer you. You asked me this yesterday, and I decided, listen, I'm going to listen to all of the comments. And so coming out of this, if I were to consider an investment opportunity, with APF, I think what I would do is I would be inspired by a working group that would form out of APF that would be willing to put together, a significant amount of capital to work collectively, and then to begin to identify. I'd put my money on the human capital side. I'd put my money on talent and people. Begin to identify those entrepreneurs that really could lift the entire field. And sometimes within philanthropy, we don't think that we can back talent, but of course we can, and there's ways to do that. So I would set up a fund, a very practical fund that emerging entrepreneurs could be able to access and use that to expand their business or their SMEs.
Thank you. That was a stimulating conversation. I don't know why APF chose you as the man that I need to have a conversation with. I'm not going to repeat everything that's been said this morning. I just want to close off with one thought and take it back to my opening story around Joseph. Having worked in the philanthropic space for a while, I want to say one thing to everybody else is we put a lot of pressure on philanthropists. We expect Randy to respond to the challenges of the world. We expect Mo to respond to every single challenge of the world. We expect Aliko to respond to every challenge of Africa. The reason I want to take it back to Joseph is philanthropy is not a monopoly. So each one of us, in our own spaces, in our own small way, can start to make an impact. It doesn't take, I know I gave him $5 billion earlier on, but he did say even with $10,000, he could have done something great. So thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to APF for giving us this opportunity to sit, and thank you for waking up on Sunday and coming here. I know it can be so difficult. Thank you.